Welcome to this episode of the Impact Disciple Making Podcast. I'm Mike Keaton, your host, and I have the privilege to be here again today with Ken Adams, lead pastor of Crossroads Church, as well as the founder of Impact Ministries. And we've been having conversations about disciple making, and this specific conversation is all about the strategy and how to lead that in the context of a local church. So thank you, Ken, for helping us out with this today. And today we want to talk about the next step. So last month we talked about the first step in leading this strategy, or part of the strategy, is to reach out. Obviously, which is evangelism and getting people, connected to Christ initially. And then the second step is lifting up Christ to the crowd.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we want to talk about that today.
Okay. So just as a reminder, right? We know what our mission is. Our mission, Jesus made it very clear, is to make disciples. And so that doesn't happen automatically. That happens because we have some intentional strategies, some intentional plans that will help to produce that, or help lead people to become that. And so that's what Jesus did. You know, when Jesus got here, think about this. When Jesus got here, he spent basically the first 30 years of his life basically in obscurity. He was a carpenter's son. He was in a small town. Jesus wasn't on the radar anywhere. Jesus wasn't creating any movements. Jesus wasn't accomplishing any mission. I mean, Jesus was flying below the radar. And then Jesus goes public with his mission and begins to start a movement. And so after being baptized by John the Baptist, then Jesus literally begins to reach out. That was the very first part of his strategy. And then the second thing Jesus did is that he lifted up his Father. He lifted up the Father, and he magnified him, and he exalted him among the culture of the people that he was trying to reach. So the second thing, the most strategic thing that Jesus did was that he lifted up the Father among crowds of people. And that is really a part of what we're doing today in order to try to reach people, help them to go from being untrained to becoming fully trained.
Right. So when we think about crowds of people, I think our minds are automatically drawn to the weekend, to the church service. And when people think of church, obviously they're going to think about maybe a location, maybe a building. They're going to think about a church service. So let's talk about that and how that plays into the whole first step or the second step of lifting up. How does the weekend fit into that disciple-making strategy?
Yeah, so you're right on point. I mean, the truth is, Mike, that when the average person thinks of the word church, they're typically thinking of a building, right? They think of a brick building with a steeple on it. They think of that being the church. Or they think of a service where there's music, where there's a choir, where there's preaching, where there's pews, where there's all this kind of stuff. And you know what's funny is that Jesus didn't have any of those. You know, Jesus didn't have a building. Jesus didn't have any of the things that we typically think of as being a church. He didn't even have a set location. Jesus was gathering people on mountainsides. Mm-hmm. Jesus was gathering people by seashores. Jesus was gathering crowds of people really everywhere he went. And the reality is that Jesus never equated a crowd with the church. Jesus saw the crowd as a part of a process of developing fully trained disciples. Mm. So we've got to change the way we think today. We've got to realize that the weekend service is not the end result of making disciples. The weekend service, what we do in a church building on a weekend, is actually a part of a process that helps us to develop fully trained disciples.
Right.
Jesus used the crowd, no question about that. But Jesus used the crowd as one part of a process of making a fully trained disciple. So when Jesus gathered a crowd, whether it be on the Mount of Beatitudes or whether it be down by the Sea of Galilee, what Jesus would do is that Jesus would use those crowds really as an opportunity to point people to the Father. And he would either do that through teaching, which obviously was different than anybody else was teaching. It was life-changing teaching. He was teaching the truth. It was drawing people to the Father. And Jesus would also even perform miracles in front of those crowds. And again, the purpose of miracles wasn't the miracle. The purpose of the miracle was to point people to the Father.
That's right.
In fact, Jesus makes a statement. I love this verse in John chapter 12, verse 32. Jesus says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." And so even Jesus is saying that when I am lifted up, that is a part of drawing people to himself. That's what happens every weekend in churches all over the world. We lift Jesus up, and guess what happens? He draws people to himself.
That's right.
So it's a part of our strategy. Lifting up is a part of our strategy of making fully trained disciples, just like it was for Jesus.
That's right. And so you mentioned earlier just a statement. You said we got to change the way we think about the weekend. And so if that is what our intention needs to be, I mean, we're talking about strategy, making disciple making strategy. Well, this is almost like a strategy within a strategy. So how do you strategize the weekend?
Yeah.
And so when you think about your planning going into our efforts to make disciples at Crossroads, I mean, what are some of the things that you take into consideration?
Wow. Man, what a great point. I mean, think about this, Mike. Think about how even just businesses and restaurants and entertainment facilities, think about how many places around the world are being incredibly strategic and using all kinds of resources, all kinds of money, all kinds of time, all types of people's talents and abilities to create environments where people have an incredible experience. And yet, think about how many churches do so little and think and don't hardly do anything to prepare for the people who show up on a weekend. You know, we think about a number of different things every single time that we do a weekend service. We put a lot of energy, time, effort, and money into creating a weekend service that is a very strategic part of helping people take another step to becoming a fully trained disciple. So a couple of things we do. First of all is we believe that the very first impression that a person experiences, most of those people we hope are coming because they've been invited. So when they get here, if somebody's invited them that's not with them, we want that person to have a great first impression.
Right.
Actually, from the minute they drive on the campus, we want signage to be good. We want the welcome to be warm. We want people to have an easy place to park, check in their kids. You know, it is if a person is far from God and truly untrained, going to the church, any church for the first time can be a pretty intimidating thing.
Absolutely.
So we want to try our best to eliminate, if not reduce, the anxiety that a person has. And we want that person to have an incredible welcome and just go, wow.
Right.
This is awesome. I love being here. And so that's the first thing we do.
Okay.
Second thing that we consider, that we do, is we want to make sure that the service itself is an incredible experience, a life-changing experience. And so we think about the music, we think about the teaching, we think about the environment, we think about all the ingredients that go into the sound, everything that goes into the actual worship experience. Here's what we want. We want it to be Christ honoring. We want it to lift up Jesus, but we want it to be biblical. We want it to be practical. We want it to be relevant. And here's the reason why. Because when Jesus did ministry, Jesus always did it in a way that related to the culture he was trying. We say that he was culturally relevant. Right. So Jesus never tried to reach the people in his culture in a way they couldn't relate to it. He did it in a very relatable way. And so we try to do that same thing. we want a great welcome. We want a great experience when they're in worship. And then really probably the last thing is that we want to make sure that people know their next step. And I think a lot of times churches give a great welcome, create a great experience, and then they let people leave there wondering, what do I do now?
Right.
And so we don't want that to happen. We want people to know really clearly, what do I do now? And so it means a couple of things. First of all, it means that we want people to know how to accept Christ, how to make a connection with Christ, and how to experience salvation. We also want them to know how to get connected to the body of Christ, how to be a part of the church. So we make it a priority every single time to help people take their next step and know what that next step is. That's what we're trying to do.
Very good. So what are some of those next steps?
So a couple of things we do in a very practical way here in our church is we do offer a quick little intro to our church right after the service. We call it Discovering Crossroads. And that's what we do here at this church called Crossroads. And then we also have a night of connections where we help people come and find out more. And the reason we do that in both cases is because in the same way that a relationship is hands down the best way to reach people who are far from God, a relationship is hands down the best way to help a person go from the community to being a part of the crowd and to becoming a part of the community of believers.
That's right. And it's so encouraging when we were able to do that, to actually get to know them and actually see them begin to take those steps and start journeying with them in that discipleship process, really.
Yeah. So a church isn't about a building, a church is about people.
Exactly.
And so we're trying to help people get connected to people.
That's right. Very good. Well, thank you, Ken. And we thank you for joining us again on this episode of the Impact Disciple Making Podcast. And hopefully this has been helpful for you, learning the second step of lifting up. And if you'll let us know, again, that you joined us, then we will send you a free resource from our Impact Resource Library. We'd love to help you in your efforts to make a disciple-making movement happen in your context. Blessings.